Hello and welcome back to the Back Porch and to another session of Back Porch Forestry. It's a crisp, clear morning this morning, beautiful morning, great opportunity to sit and learn together about the subject of forestry. I'm Dr. David Merker, Extension Forester with the University of Tennessee, and Back Porch Forestry includes a series of what I'm calling 30-30s, roughly 30 slides in 30 minutes. They're not overly detailed, but instead offering just general education on the topics of trees and forests and forest management. The intended audience is private forest landowners, but of course others might find this interesting and useful too. So at the conclusion, you'll find a participant survey. I hope that you'll take the time to fill that out. I'll also have some information on where you can find some publications that kind of elaborate on the topic that we're covering today. So kick back on your porch and let's enjoy this session together of Back Porch Forestry. Back Porch Forestry. We're going to be studying the subject of silviculture over this session and the two that will follow. And specifically today, we're going to be addressing the issue of establishing the forest. We can't cover this in great detail, but I'll give you some insight that might help you as you manage your forest land. So as you look back, well, let's put it this way. If we were to go back in time 100 to maybe 150 years and studied our landscape, many of us would be appalled at how the landscape looked. In the process of developing our nation, we had kind of exploited the land. We had cut too many trees, and the soil and the trees alike, it took a toll on them. But through silviculture, through the educated caress of conservation, the land was able to be restored. And that's where the profession of forestry and the science of silviculture comes in. The point is that our forests are not heading toward destruction. They're actually returning from it. So let's define the word silviculture. That's kind of a mouthful. We break that word down and we see the Latin word silva, which means forest trees. We also see the word culture, which means controlling the growth of something. So if we put them together, foresters are controlling the growth of forest trees, Now, silviculture is accomplished in three different phases. And so we have the establishment phase, getting the forest started. There are the intermediate operations, which is what do we do to the forest while it is developing. And then the final stage is, I refer to it as harvest. It's actually a regeneration stage. And eventually we'll get to all three of these legs of the triangle. But today we're going to be focusing on the establishment stage of silviculture. So a few concepts I wanted to get across as we get started that will help you through each leg of the triangle, the silvicultural triangle. And one of the things you need to understand is forest age structure. And so there are different age structures. One example is an even-aged forest. This is a stand of trees composed of a single age class originating from an abandoned field or a pasture, maybe a clear-cut harvest, or even a natural disaster. So for instance, after a tornado has come in and eliminated the trees, it immediately begins growing back to an even-aged stand. And so here's an example of an even-aged stand. These are just saplings, roughly about 8 years old. It's an area, it was a cove of a field that was abandoned. The farmer didn't want to farm this little patch anymore. And immediately the forces of succession took over and it grew back to a young, even-aged forest. You're looking at probably about 3,000 saplings per acre in that photograph. But likewise, this is also an even-aged forest. It's just much further advanced. In other words, the trees competed with themselves over a course of 80 to 100 years. And of those original 3,000 saplings per acre, we might only have 50 to 75 of the original trees left, but they are both even-aged forests. Now, an even-aged forest can be differentiated with an uneven-aged forest. And so an uneven-aged forest is a situation where we have three or more age classes that are all present in the forest. And I'm not using a photograph to depict this. I'm actually using a graph to show you what I mean by an even-aged forest. So you see our graph, and you see on the x-axis the acronym DBH, which stands for diameter at breast height. So we measure trees, foresters measure trees at 4.5 feet above the ground, called DBH, or diameter at breast height. And you notice the continuum here. We have small diameter trees and large diameter trees. In other words, they're mature. So small to large. Now on the y-axis, we have the number of trees or the number of stems. So in an uneven aged forest, you would expect to have a whole lot of small diameter trees descending all the way down to very few mature trees. It's a reversed J-shaped curve. If you were to plot an uneven aged forest, that's what it would look like. Now, foresters also talk about crown classes in a forest. And so we have 4 of them that are identified: dominant, codominant, intermediate, and suppressed. Dominant trees are those which receive direct sunlight both from the side as well as from the top. And so they are dominant. They receive an ample amount of sunlight. And because of that, they typically are big trees that grow up above the rest of the trees. Codominant trees, the Cs, receive some sunlight from the side, but receive most of their sunlight from the top. So they are codominant in nature. Now the intermediate trees, the Is, they don't receive any sunlight from the side. They receive sunlight only from the top, and usually only over a portion of the day. So for instance, between say 2 or 10 and 2 in the day, they might get their shot of sunlight. And then finally, the S trees are those that are suppressed. They're not receiving any direct sunlight. They receive diffuse sunlight that just happens to make its way down through the forest canopy. So there's a tendency to think that dominant trees are the old ones and S or suppressed trees are the young ones. And that can be the case. Oftentimes it is. But in an even-aged forest, actually all these trees are the same age. It's just that the dominant ones have monopolized the site, and the suppressed trees are eventually going to die because of that. So dominant, codominant, intermediate, and suppressed. Now, shade tolerance is the ability of the plant to grow in the shade of another taller plant. That's a concept you need to understand if you're going to be managing your forest. And so some trees are considered intolerant to shade. So they might get started in the shade, but they don't endure there long, because they just need a lot of sunlight. And so here's a whole host of trees that are considered intolerant to shade. They won't live for very long in the shade of an overstory tree. Now, adjacent to that would be what we would call the moderately shade tolerant trees. In other words, these trees can tolerate some shade, but sometime over the course of the day, they need a direct shot of sunlight. And here's an example of trees that fall into moderately shade tolerant. And then those that are considered tolerant to shade. Now, that doesn't mean that they prefer the shade, but it means that they can live there for a long, long time. Sugar maple, beech, and so forth. I once saw a picture taken at a university forest where they took a snapshot of the picture and documented all the trees that were in that picture in the forest. And then they came back 23 years later and took the same picture. Nothing had happened to the forest. They hadn't harvested anything. They just let it grow. And then they redocumented the trees in the second picture. And in the first picture, there was a sugar maple that was 2 inches in diameter, 2 inches in diameter. And in the second picture, 23 years later, that sugar maple was 3 inches in diameter. So in 23 years, it existed in the shade and only grew an inch. So we call the shade intolerance the pioneer trees. These typically are the ones that are first to invade a sunny site. And these would be the climax trees, the ones that can endure if there are no disturbances in the forest, like fire or harvesting or storm damage or whatnot. These trees will eventually become the climax forest in much of the eastern hardwood region. Now, in this establishment stage of the forest, oftentimes this is referred to as regeneration. That's the process of renewing a forest. What you'll find is that there are different methods of regeneration. There are natural methods, and then there's artificial methods. Actually, natural methods just essentially means you're allowing the environment to restore the forest itself. In other words, you have no control of the composition. The wind blows seeds in, the birds will defecate seeds, and of course trees come up from that. Squirrels will bury nuts and so forth. So it's what you get, but you have very little control over this. Now, artificial regeneration, this is where we have human manipulation in the establishment process of the forest. And so we're going to either plant seeds, that's not done very, very often, but it can be done, or we're actually planting bare root stock, seedlings, in other words. And so as you might expect, the cost of these methods goes up as labor intensity goes up. So natural regeneration is pretty much free, whereas the planting of seeds or seedlings can run the cost up quite a bit. Here's an example of natural regeneration. This is a hickory tree that was already growing in the forest prior to the harvest. So it would have an opportunity to grow once the trees are removed. Here's an example of a forest about 5 years after a clear cut. And this is all natural regeneration. These trees weren't planted, they just came in on their own. Looks a little rough in this stage, and it is to the eye, but it's nothing more than a young forest. We like old forest, we like old growth, but we must remember that all old growth begins as young growth. And if you were a self-respecting turkey trying to find a nest for your eggs or protect the poults once they've been hatched, this would be an excellent young forest to be in. Artificial regeneration on the right, this is an example. These are being machine planted. Sometimes they're planted, more often they're probably planted by hand than by machine, but both are examples of artificial regeneration. Now, we need to differentiate between the words reforestation and afforestation. Oftentimes they're used, the word reforestation is used for both these examples, but there's a difference. Reforestation is the reestablishment of a forest on land that was prior forested. In other words, it was a forest, you harvested it, and then it's going to revert back or come back or be planted back to a forest. This is reforestation. Afforestation is the establishment of a forest on a site that wasn't preceding a forest. It was, in other words, it was a field or it was a pasture, and whole different sets of tree planting recommendations depending on if it's reforestation or afforestation. So some requirements for successful artificial regeneration. The seeds or seedlings should be from within a 100-mile radius of the planting site, or at least similar climate. Now that can be difficult because oftentimes the nurseries are 200 or 300 miles away, and they may not know exactly where all those seeds come from, other than they may say within the state. So that's a hard thing to control, but if you can, it would be nice. Secondly, the seedling source should not differ within about 300 feet of elevation as well. But the same holds true with that. Unless you're collecting the nuts and growing the seedlings yourself, that's a pretty hard thing to control. Then also seeds, they may need to be stratified or scarified. Stratification or stratified implies that they have to go through a cold storage. And so walnut and red oak are examples of seeds that have to actually be stored in a cold period over a couple months before they'll germinate. Other seeds like white oak germinate immediately in the fall of the year, but scarification or scarified, that's the breaking of the seed coat down. And so you can't typically just plant a locust seed if the seed hasn't been scarified first. And oftentimes these are ingested by animals, and that's how scarification occurs. The stomach acids break the seed coat down, and as they pass it through, the seed is ready to germinate. Continuing on here, we'll talk about site preparation for regeneration. And the definition of that is you're just manipulating the establishment site. You're trying to improve the overall survival of the seedlings. So you're going to be controlling the vegetation, the slash, maybe subsoiling if it's compacted soil, and or liming or fertilizing. So it's good to conduct a soil test before you plant the trees to see if there's a deficiency. So there's different methods of site preparation. Fire can sometimes be used to expose the mineral soil, particularly if you're relying on natural regeneration. You have some adjacent seed trees nearby that are a seed source. This is common more so with pine, but fire does improve access for planting too, so it makes it easier to plant. So that's a form of site preparation, as is chemical. This is probably the most common form of site preparation. Before you plant, you really need to evaluate the site to see what kind of competition you're going to have. Is it grasses? Grasses are competitive with trees. They rob the the soil moisture and the fertility. Fescue is disastrous if you're trying to plant trees into fescue. So you need to control your grass first. Kudzu naturally is a bad thing too, not because it competes so much for soil moisture and fertility, but because it competes for sunlight. It overtops the seedlings and suppresses them. So those two particularly need to be controlled before you're going to plant trees. Briars aren't a big problem. In fact, weeds in general don't bother me unless they get really tall. They're very dense. So, but you might want to control the briars and other woody vegetation, broadleaves, and so forth. There's mechanical site preparation, which includes disking, perhaps bulldozing if it's major. There's a roller chopper that's used to chop things up, and now they have mulching machines. Be careful with disking. I like disking, except if it's done at the wrong time of the year, it exposes the soil right when undesirable trees that may be nearby are seeding or throwing their seed. And so I've seen some real disasters with box elder, river birch, sycamore, cottonwood, sweet gum too, where they drop their seeds all year long, or excuse me, in the winter months, and then you plant into it not realizing these seeds are there, and you end up with more of these undesirable trees than what you want, creating another problem. And then, of course, there's just manual site preparation, maybe the use of a chainsaw, herbicide to control some trees that were left out in a regeneration opening in a forest, and you want to plant back in those, but you don't want to bring a dozer in or something like that. Herbicide applications, there are some advantages of that, and it's primarily, it's economic. It's much cheaper to spray things and to get out there with manual labor and try to control it. It does save time, fewer treatments, and it can be selective. Herbicides are out there to kill grasses, but not broadleaves, to kill hardwoods, but not pines, depending on what your objective is and what you're trying to grow. There's some disadvantages, though. They're seasonal. You can't spray year round, so the timing is important. It's possible to kill non-target species if it's careless. There can be some, and I put it in quotation marks, can be some damage to the environment if it's not properly used, but that's why you want to use licensed herbicide applicators to make sure that it's done right. The research has been done, and we know that we can do it right as long as the directions are followed. So, something to remember, it's better not to have planted than to have planted incorrectly. And so you must begin by matching the species to the site. So what are some site characteristics? What's included in that? Well, the soil, we can't say enough about soil. That really controls the whole planting. And so you need to go to the soil survey and discover what type of soil type you have, and particularly the drainage pattern. If there's hard pan or mottled soil, gray color in it, that indicates high water table or poor internal drainage, and you're limited to the species that you can plant on those sites. Texture refers to the percentage of sand, silt, and clay that's in your soil. That determines what can be planted. Of course, fertility, organic matter. You want to look at the climate too. What is the macro climate? You don't want to plant tropical trees in the mountains of East Tennessee and vice versa. So think about the climate, what species are native, and even the microclimate too, because trees might grow well on the cooler side of the hill than on the warmer side of the hill, or vice versa. That comes down really to the aspect, which is what direction that a slope faces. And so we would expect in our region, the south and southwesterly slopes to be very dry. And so if you're planting on a hillside that's facing those directions, you'll be limited to the species that can be planted there. And then the position on the slope too. Are you planting high on a hill, on the side slope, or further down, maybe even in a bottom, because all of these influence the growth rate of the tree. So working with a forester will develop a forest management plan and take a tree planting plan and take all of these things into consideration. Now, there are some species that are tolerant to drought. They can endure prolonged dry spells, and that includes cedar, hickory. You can see the list. White oak, southern red oak are moderately tolerant and slow starters, but they can endure on drier sites better than other species. And the other extreme then would be trees that are intolerant to drought. So you can see the list there. If it's a dry site, you don't want to plant northern red oak or tulip tree on that. They prefer sites that are what we call mesic, in other words, in the middle of soil moisture regime. Now, once you've matched the species to the site, you're ready now to plant the trees. And there's a lot to be said about this, more than can be told in one slide, but a few things to consider is that you really need to store those seedlings properly, because you get them early and maybe you're able to plant them right away, but maybe you can't because of the weather, soil conditions, rain, and so forth. And so it's best if you've got something lined up ahead of time where you can put those seedlings where it's cool and humidified. That will keep them in a dormant stage. Now, anytime you're moving the seedlings around, it's best if they are contained in some kind of a trailer that's enclosed to avoid high wind and high temperatures. In the least, you need to cover them with a tarp as you're transporting them. And there are reflective tarps that can be used once you get on the site that will reflect the sun's heat away from the seedlings, which is good. We want to plant in late winter and early spring. In our region of Tennessee, that would include the months primarily of February and March, sometimes in January. But once you get into April, particularly by mid-April, it's going to be challenging for the seedlings to survive unless you just, particularly if you have a dry spring. We want to plant on cooler days and at cooler times of the day as well. And so if the temperature gets above about 70, 75 degrees and windy, you probably ought to shut the operation down or plan on stopping pretty soon that time of the day. And then also we want to plant them correctly. That's a science in itself, but we want to plant to the proper depth. You'll be able to see where the seedling was in the nursery. You'll see the soil line. If anything, it's better to plant them a little bit too deep than too shallow. And you want to make sure that the soil is really firmly packed around the seedlings to eliminate the air pockets that might dry out the seedlings. And then do a survival check too, or have your forester help you with that during the growing season. Here's an example of a tree spacing chart, and you'll see the spacing 2 feet by 2 feet all the way down to 25 by 25 feet. And it just gives you an idea of how many trees that would represent on a per acre basis. So we see 4 by 4 spacing. You're not going to plant trees on a 4 by 4 spacing, at least not in most situations, but this does closely mimic what's found in a natural forest after it's been harvested, particularly clear cut. You'll have easily up to 3,000 seedlings per acre because they'll be 4 feet by 4 feet apart or tighter. Most trees that are planted in open settings are planted on a 10 by 10 spacing, which gives you 436 seedlings per acre. Kind of the minimum that's acceptable is 300 trees per acre in an open setting. You get beyond that and the trees, well, the stocking just isn't high enough. The trees are develop into short bodies with open branch structure and not really good lumber. And I've just shown you what a 25 by 25 foot spacing gives you 70 trees per acre. You want to do the weed control and the mowing. That's very important. I encourage weed control for the first 3 growing seasons and mowing as well, long enough so that the seedlings can get their heads up above the weed competition. And then after that, it shouldn't be a big concern unless you have something like kudzu that might give you fits. So what effect does spacing have on these items, on these situations? The rate of canopy closure, the mortality of the lower branches, the vegetation, the height growth of your trees, and the first thinning. So what we're talking about, this spacing chart that I just showed you, tighter spacings, the effect of tight spacing is that on the first consideration here, the rate of canopy closure, the canopy is going to close sooner, as you would expect if you've got more trees per acre. The canopy is going to close up quicker, and that can be a good thing because what will happen is these lower branches will remain smaller and they will die out sooner. And that's important because that gives you cleaner lumber down the road, fewer defects because of the knots. Now, regarding the vegetation control, this competition is going to die out sooner if we have tight spacing. So as you can imagine, when the side branches come together and they touch each other, the sunlight's no longer reaching the floor and the ground vegetation is going to decline. That can be a bad thing for wildlife. And so it's kind of a trade-off with tighter spacings. Now, regarding height growth, trees generally, of course, grow taller initially if you have tight spacing because they're pushing themselves up. They're reaching for that sunlight, and so they grow tight, which is what you want early on your trees before you thin them, which we'll cover in our next session on silviculture, on intermediate operations. So, and then, of course, your first thinning is going to have to occur sooner if you have a tight spacing. But there are some problems with tight spacing. As I've already mentioned, it has to be thinned sooner. The diameter growth rate will be suppressed in tight spacing, and so you've got to thin it out in order to keep the growth rate going. The live crown ratio is reduced, and that refers to that proportion of the total tree height that has living branches that will be reduced. And the trees can be susceptible to disturbances such as insect and disease, maybe weather related. Real tight spacing, the trees kind of develop a whippy form, and they can sometimes blow over once you do release them. So you have to be careful. So here's some summary remarks coming straight to you from the back porch. If you're going to be involved in a tree planting project, begin with a tree planting plan. There are foresters out there that can help you with that. The State Division of Forestry develops these plans, and along with that, the plan will qualify you for cost share assistance. So remember this, when you're planting trees, particularly hardwoods, you're typically doing it for the next generation or next generations. And so it can be challenging to carry that much of an investment well into the future. And so that's why this cost share to help pay for the establishment of trees. It's important that you do the site preparation. Don't neglect that. Don't bother planting trees if you haven't done the site preparation. It's also important too that you order the trees the summer prior to the planting date, or otherwise if you wait too long, they may be sold out, or you might not get the species that you want. And then plant trees early while they are still dormant. You really don't want seedlings to be leafed out when you put them in the ground because they're very susceptible to either a late frost or to drought that can scorch those leaves. And then do your weed control and the bush hogging, as I said, for the first 3 years. And then your forest will be off to a good start. So remember, silviculture is accomplished in 3 phases. We've addressed the establishment phase today. There's the intermediate operations, and then there's the harvest stage. And so our next session on Back Porch Forestry will be looking at intermediate operations. What do you do to the forest while it is developing? So here's the final slide. There's a lot on there. You might want to just pull your camera out and take a picture of that, or you can write it down. There's a survey that would help me out. I encourage you to go to that website and fill out the survey. And then there's 2 publications that support what's been addressed today. One's written by me, Tree Planting Procedure for Small Bare Root Seedlings, and the other by Dr. Wayne Clatterbuck, an excellent publication on some site preparation and competition control guidelines if you're going to plant trees. And so you can just Google either one of those titles and the last name of the author, and it'll pull right up. So I'll leave this up here for a second, and I look forward to seeing you in the woods very soon. Thank you for your participation today.